It
Yeah.
sounds like you haven't really had time to take breath since March.
No, it's been pretty full on. I mean, I'm in the employment team. There's 40 odd employment lawyers, and all of whom are pretty much working flat out. You know, having just come off the back of 4 weekends of work, I'm feeling a bit knackered, frankly.
So you keeping an eye on their well-being?
Yeah, we have multiple events going on all the time with the team, and we meet up regularly, although Zoom, I suspect, is being severely overused at the moment.
Well, I don't think the founder's too bothered, really. I think his
I don't think so.
valuation has soared, hasn't it? It's zoomed up a bit later,
Yeah.
but no, great to see.
Also, over to you, Lydia. I mean, it's a topic that's been referenced a few times today already, hasn't it? So, unconscious bias.
Yeah, I mean, can you tell us a little bit about what you're doing as an organisation around creating that inclusive culture?
Yeah, well, I was going to give a little talk about unconscious bias more generally, but in the organisation, there's a lot wider awareness of it now, and you know, I have given this talk to our own staff in particular, and of course with Black Lives Matter happening recently, that's the more overt element of discrimination is very much in the limelight, and I think that it's important that we don't forget the unconscious element of it. And it needs a lot of thought. Shall I launch into it a little
Please
bit?
do, Boy.
I mean,
yours.
Okay. I mean, it's good that Tim mentioned unconscious bias when he was just speaking, but it's something which has come more to the forefront. It's been in the news. I think I mentioned in my short introduction, the written introduction, that a group of MPs had refused to undergo unconscious bias training. What I didn't say is that one of them nicely wrote my introduction for me by calling unconscious bias talks Marxist snake oil crap. So I thought I'd try and address that in this talk by really talking about what it is, you know, whether it's bad, how we can address it, you know, does it affect us all of those kinds of issues. So briefly, in what it is. You know, it's often called implicit bias as well as unconscious bias, but implicit bias is generally the phrase that's used in academic studies, and unconscious bias is less academic. And there are loads of different definitions, some of which get wordy and confusing, but the easiest one essentially is stereotyping. You know, if we assume it's stereotyping, which in a way is making judgments on less than complete information, which you know, is that a bad thing? I mean, does it mean is that necessarily bad? Is the first question. Is it evil? Is all unconscious bias evil? And one of the things I found quite instructive to read is that you know, the brain is bombarded with information, about 11 million pieces of information per second, and it naturally takes shortcuts, and it naturally makes these jumps. And there's a really easy example where, you know, if we have a bat and a ball, and they cost £1.10 together, and the bat is £1 more than the ball, how much is the ball? And you know, the answer to that question is 5p, but the brain is screaming at you, it's 10p, and that's an example of the sort of shortcut which we're taking. Of course, if the ball was 10p and the bat was £1, then the difference would be 90p, not £1. But the brain sort of screams at you that it's 10p, and it's just an example of the kind of shortcut that the brain can take based on that information and come to the wrong conclusions. And there are lots of other examples of, you know, sort of non-evil unconscious bias, if I can call it that. And my favorite one at the moment is called hindsight bias. And it's a tendency of people to think that they've predicted the future more accurately than they actually have. And with COVID swirling around us, there are so many commentators who said they predicted things, which when you think back, you think, well, I'm not sure you did. And actually, it's not just commentators. You know, I get it in my own household, frankly. But there are more evil, more sinister sides to this. I mean, I don't think as a society we tend to tolerate overt discrimination now. Certainly less than we used to. Overt discrimination, I think, has diminished. I mean, if you saw any of those Steve McQueen small acts programs, I mean, it's pretty shocking to think that, you know, within our lifetime, or certainly within my lifetime, that things were as awful and as blatant as that. But I think there's also, you know, I think there has been a diminution in overt discrimination in this country. But I also think you can't ignore that because Kick It Out, which is an organisation devoted to eliminating discrimination in football, I was really interested and frightened to read that they'd noted a 42% increase in racial harassment and a 98% increase in sexual orientation abuse in the last season over the season before. So I think overt discrimination is still very much with us. But unconscious bias and covert discrimination is also extremely important. And why does it actually matter? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious, it seems to me, why we should be seeking to try and eliminate all forms of discrimination. What may be less obvious is the effect that has purely in business terms. So there's a study by Carnegie Mellon some time ago where a lot of my team loved this particular study and the result from it, because the study they did found that teams with at least one woman in them had a collectively higher IQ than those teams without any women in them. And it's that kind of thing that is used liberally, I must say, within my team, that study. And that kind of bias, even the sex bias, which you may think has diminished slightly, is still there. And there are a couple of other studies which I think sort of demonstrate what I'm talking about. There was a study in the US where a load of CVs, identical CVs, were submitted, some with sort of typical white names and some with typical black names. And the results from that study, it showed that the CVs, which were identical, who had white names on it, had a 50% higher chance of a callback from potential employers, which is pretty shocking. There was a similar study involving identical CVs with men and women's names. This was a bit more targeted. It was targeted at 130 science professors. And those science professors were asked to evaluate the ability of the people whose CVs they were looking at. And they were also asked to suggest a starting salary. And for all of the names, the male named CVs, again, identical CVs, and you'd think these people would be relatively objective, being professors of science, their average score was 4 out of 7. And for the female named CVs, it was 3 out of 7. That's just on ability. The average starting salary suggested for the men was 30,000. The average starting salary for the women was 26,000. So those, I think, show that this issue arises. That's on identical information. So this issue arises on recruitment, on pay rises, on bonuses, even down to sort of team selection. And there are various ways of addressing it. A very simple way of addressing it at the recruitment stage is having blind CVs, which are increasingly common. So not having names on CVs. I mean, a lot of CVs don't have ages on now anyway, and increasingly, and certainly don't have photographs, which used to be relatively common years ago. But not having names on is a way of addressing that potential for unconscious bias. But I think Tim mentioned previously, adjusting language and adjusting attitudes is very important. And there are certain things which come up quite a lot. So, assuming that the man out of the two people that you're meeting is the more senior, who's going to make the team? This happens all the time. One which I find quite common is confusing people of similar or the same race. Now, there's happened to a particular friend of mine who is half Hong Kong Chinese. And the first time that he was asked how he enjoyed his secondment to an overseas office, he thought it was quite funny when he realised that actually the person was talking about a Korean colleague who looks, I have to say, absolutely nothing like him. The third time he was asked about it, it became a little bit irritating. And when I give that example to people, say, I'm relatively, I can sort of understand that. I'm terrible with names and faces. But I don't wander around calling everybody John on the off chance. And stepping back and having a bit of a thought about it makes a big difference in those scenarios. And probably the strongest thing that you can say with unconscious bias, and the strongest way that you can try and address it, is constantly questioning yourself. And if you don't feel that you can do that efficiently enough, get a devil's advocate. Have somebody that you trust to push you. Why have you chosen that person for that team? Why have you chosen to push that person through to the next stage of an interview process? And challenge those decisions that you're making. And I think that, you know, stepping back and doing that is a major step towards addressing it. Now, to quote those MPs who refused unconscious bias training, I'm wrapping up, and I'm hoping that it wasn't as unpleasant as gouging your own eyes out with a blunt stick, which was another direct quote about somebody who was asked to undergo this form of training. But anyway, there are loads and loads of studies in this area, and if anybody's interested in them, you know, feel free to email me, and I've got lots of background information for it. But I think the real strong message about this is testing your own preconceptions, testing your decisions, questioning what you're doing, and if not, asking someone else to do it.
Really insightful, yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, I don't know whether you were with us with Leela from the IPA and talking about appointing a diversity director.
Diversity internally, and not getting them reporting to HR, but getting them to actually be on the board and to have that person there to actually challenge the decisions that are being made at the highest level in an organisation. So that's sort of in line with your comment just then. I
think that's really useful, and we have somebody who's employed to do exactly that. As a diversity director, and then marshal together the various different groups that we have, so wraith and face committees and LGBT and allies and those kinds of things as well. And having one repository of that knowledge is very, very helpful, because particularly it means things like LGBT and race and faith can work together to the same ends, rather than having some form of clash of rights, which occasionally happens as well.
Our viewers to come up with one thing that they would do in their organisation to take action, rather than just talking about what they might do. We're going to get you to be the first, Paul. I'm sure you do an awful lot at Penningtons. You've already said that you do. So hypothetically, you're working for somebody else. What's the one action that you're going to take that we can commit to hashtag B41 promise?
I think blind CVs is an easy and concrete thing that you can do straight away. And it makes a difference. There was something I heard on Radio 4 about probably about 6 months ago, where it was an orchestra, and they found the Orchestra of the Age of Enlightenment, they were called, and they found that they were fishing in a relatively small pond when they were getting people in that orchestra, and they knew a lot of the people that they were seeing either by reputation or having worked with them in the past, and so they decided to interview everybody behind a screen and just get them to play. And not only did they find it more, they thought they were making better decisions, but what was really surprising was the interview panel had a much higher degree of unanimity when it came to choosing those applicants. And I think, you know, so that blind TV element is a major step.
It's almost like a
taste test, really, I suppose, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, brilliant.
Great, thank you so much.
No.
Any last words?
Sounds like he's about to walk the plank, poor man.
No, I was given a very strict time limit, and I've stuck to it.
No, you've done incredibly well. We're just guilty of maybe getting a bit too quick. So yeah, we've got another couple of minutes, Paul. So if there's anything else you'd like to add? I mean, do shout out your email address and the call to action to get in contact with.
And some of the relevant links as well.
Yeah, and the relevant links as well.
Yeah,
you've got them.
I mean, if you go on to Penningtons Manches People is the name of the firm, and you know, you can just Google them and find any of us there. I'm Paul.Mander at penningtonslaw.com. I suppose one other thing may be worth mentioning while we've got a little bit of time, which is microaggressions. You know, we hear a lot about it, and what I have found is there is an element of confusion about what they are. And you know, there are a few examples that you can give, and again, this is based on assumptions. You know, I mentioned a couple of them earlier about, you know, assuming the woman of two people is the less senior, for example, being one of them. But, you know, assuming all black people are good at sport, is another one which comes up again and again. One of my favourites, bropriating. Have you heard about bropriating? It's where a woman comes up with an idea in a meeting and it's not really seized upon, and then a man says exactly the same thing but a little bit louder, and everyone, oh, that's a brilliant idea. And being aware of that kind of thing, which it sounds ludicrous, but actually it does occasionally happen.
It happens, yeah.
Now, when you talk about microaggressions, there was a young lady who's swims for the GB Olympic team. She's black, and she was on Radio 5 Live talking about the challenges that she's faced in getting to the position that she's in now. And it's incredible to hear her journey and this microaggressions that she's experienced all along the way, but she's made it to the top of her game. So hats off to her. No.
That is interesting. We did a survey within our own firm, actually, which where we asked. I know that nobody likes the phrase BAME, but we asked all of our staff whether they had ever experienced anything that made them feel uncomfortable, whether it be overt or covert racism or microaggressions, and the result of that is 100%. Every single person,
yeah.
And you can't underestimate it. And I think that surprised a number of the white middle-aged men like me.
Well, learning, Paul, and it's good to learn from you today. So I really appreciate you joining us today.
Yeah,
and we're spot on time.
As well, so,
yeah, absolutely
Thank
superb.
you.